Welcome to the first episode of the new series of the Business Engineer. In this first episode, in which I try to tackle what I think are the most interesting topics that really are at the intersection of business technology, innovation, and strategy, I interview Tim Higgins. Tim Higgins is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, is the author of a couple of books that really are in my among like the book some of the books I love the most. One is Power Play, with the history of Tesla that he wrote like a few years back, and I had Tim in an interview on my past episodes on the 4 Week MBA podcast. And right now, instead, I'm actually having Tim as the starting guest for my new series for the business engineer, but this time is about this new book, incredible book, which is called iWar. iWar is really, as we'll see in the conversation, the story of how Apple came to become really the company that defined the whole business and technological business ecosystem of the last like 15, almost 20 years. And really, throughout the conversation, we touch upon several of the companies that crossed Apple roads in those years, the relationship among Apple and some key players like Google, like Facebook, how those relationships evolved over the years, how Apple changed as a company over the years, and then we look forward to what might happen in an era of AI. So enjoy the conversation. Tim, thank you for joining me for this conversation. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you.
Well, thank you for your interest.
Yeah, and we had the chance actually to speak. I think it was like a few years back when you just had published like a Power Play. That honestly has been one of the books I enjoyed the most about like Tesla. And I think probably you're one of the few like authors, like journalists and reporters that I guess when you go into like a research, you really even if you go like with a thesis, then you might adjust along the way with what the research is telling you about the topic, which is what I like about the way you do, the writing, which I love. So going a little bit into the topic, you wrote an amazing book, which I got here. You have also like behind you, which is an amazing book, which is iWar, and I think it's quite an important book right now because it tells the story of Apple, which probably is like the platforms. Platform meaning is really the ecosystem that on top of which the whole business world has developed in the last like 15 years. So, what was the motivation for you to go in that direction after you had written such a great book like Power Play?
Yeah, I'm attracted to interesting corporate dramas, right? And when I wrote Power Play, that was an incredible corporate turnaround. It was unclear that Tesla was going to survive, and being able to tell the story of how they were able to not only survive but thrive was a lot of fun and very interesting. And when I looked at kind of what I was going to do next, I was in my day job at the Wall Street Journal, I was writing a lot about Apple. Apple was facing kind of an unusual situation for itself in that some of its rivals were really testing its control over the marketplace. And again, I was watching this in real time and thought, this is just an amazing drama that's playing out. These are larger than life characters, and the stakes are just enormous, huge, trillions of dollars. And what better kind of way to spend some time than kind of to dig deep into that and tell that story.
Very, very cool. And I think probably when we look at Apple, it's very hard to forget how influential it's been like on the whole business like ecosystem. If you think that even a company like Facebook, really thrived on top of an ecosystem, and it was not given because as we see together, maybe there's been like a period where Apple has not made things easy for Facebook, which is also part of the story that you cover. But what you've seen in your research, like how did Apple stumble as well on becoming like such giant business ecosystem in the first place?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You go back. I mean, it's hard to kind of remember the history now. When we think of these iPhones, it just seems like a runaway success. And early when they revealed it, people were really excited about it. But the world changed. A year later is when they created the App Store, and the App Store was a big breakthrough. It would make the iPhone more useful. It would create a lot of different uses that we now take for granted. But at the time, one of the big changes was just thinking about how you would acquire software from a third party, right? Ever going to shopping malls and stores and buying these boxes and taking the discs home and putting them in your computer and downloading it? That was like a cumbersome process, not only for the consumer, but also for the developer, right? They had to have kind of a way of deploying that. And the promise of the App Store from Apple was that anybody really who is a developer could create their idea and publish it into this world and essentially for free. Yes, if you were a developer, you had to pay kind of a nominal fee to be in there. But if you were offering it for free, then Apple would let you do your business there. If you were going to charge the user, Apple was going to take a percentage of that. And this was kind of exciting to a lot of people. In fact, even going back to when they announced, it's not clear that everybody realized how big of a deal it was going to be. You remember the iPhone was revealed at this massive event and almost 20 years ago. People were very excited. It was a smaller event a year later, and it came after kind of an outcry from third parties wanting to be on the iPhone and why they wanted to be on the iPhone. Because the original vision from Steve Jobs when he first revealed the iPhone was that Apple was going to have some apps on the phone that could take advantage of the hardware in a very unique way. But if you wanted somebody else's software, it was going to be through basically a web kind of version of that. And that meant, in practicality, that it wasn't going to be that third-party software wasn't really going to be able to take advantage of all the things that the iPhone could do, which were very unique at that time and very exciting. As you started seeing some third-party developers essentially hack the iPhone to get on board, if you will. And so really there was this kind of dilemma. Was Apple going to kind of continue on with what it was and kind of this weird environment, or were they going to open it up? And it was very clear inside that they were going to open it up at a certain point. Now, some of the people that were working on it talk about how they didn't, they had to convince Steve Jobs. Some of the people I talked to, they think of it a little bit differently in that Steve Jobs had this great ability to kind of narrow what the issue was at the time. Getting the phone out was key, making that successful was key, and then the bandwidth to, okay, how to do the App Store. There was concerns about third-party software on the phone, right? This was a phone. People were worried about how you're going to be able to make a call when you need to, right? So there was worries about that. And also, remember computers at that time were plagued by spam and viruses and all sorts of junk out there. And the Steve Jobs Apple wanted to make sure that the user environment was useful and pleasant and not dangerous. And so there was this kind of tension going on. But the reveal of the App Store would be very important kind of to the history of Apple. It would change the course of the company, but it would also kind of change the course of kind of digital marketplaces in a lot of ways.
Very, very interesting point, and I think many people still miss this fact that you just explained. And on my both blog and newsletter, when I do like a little bit of historical analysis, I always show how the real turning point has not been like 2007 launch of the iPhone, but really, or even in terms of like sales, things like became like quite interesting once the App Store came out, which was like, as you say, like an event that was not as sponsored by sponsor as it was like the launch of the iPhone, but it was like a turning moment. Um,
Hmm.
and also, as you say, like a very weird moment for a company like Apple that was as probably like two souls inside. One that wanted to succeed as a platform, but also a sort of company where, as you say, Steve Jobs was like sort of a control freak, right? He was like quite concerned about what people would do with his device because he was also concerned about the aesthetics of it outside just like the usability. And
Yep.
I guess that show that has shown as well in your research in the early App Store days, right? What is something that you saw that interesting that shaped also like its philosophy and how the ecosystem started to develop back then?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me first say that the initial kind of excitement was from all corners, especially individual developers who saw this as kind of a potential to do something much easier to get their software out to the world. And there was almost like a gold rush mentality because whoever had the most clever idea could win the day, right? And one of the early apps that was the must-have app that everybody was showing off at, cocktail parties was the iBeer, which was, the screen would look like a mug of beer and it would use the kind of the mechanics of the phone, and if you tipped it, it looked like you were drinking that beer, right? And that was just clever, and that was fun. And the guy who did that ended up making a lot of money, and that was kind of cool. But obviously, things would go on to be real businesses. But we'll get to that in a second. One of the things that Steve Jobs was very concerned about was kind of what that ecosystem of those apps would be like, right? He wanted to have a certain level of professionalism. They had to have a certain kind of you couldn't just put junk in there. They wanted to allow experimentation, but they didn't want garbage, right? One of the kind of the red lines, if you will, was no pornography. He didn't want this to be pornography, have pornography in the app store. So on the surface, that seems simple, but over time, kind of interpreting some of these ideas would become more challenging, right? Because as developers saw the marketplace, they also wanted to test to see what was possible, right? And so the App Store would be inundated with the developers trying to put all sorts of racy material into their apps, and so it would be kind of a whack-a-mole situation. But there are other businesses that were being created that were very interesting as well. I mean, we would see the rise of Instagram. We would see the rise of Uber. We would see kind of the expansion of Facebook into mobile. I mean, these were interesting times. And also, we would see kind of the rise of mobile video games, which was an interesting kind of development as well. Um, and so, in those early days, you would see some of the green shoots of potential that were popping up.
Yeah, so super interesting. Connecting to that point, then, what are like some of the startup stories that you found more interesting? And I know that there are so many in the book. Like you find out like, and again, it's very hard to realize how much of the whole ecosystem that we live today, just came out of the this moment of the App Store. But going back to your research, what is that you saw? From the startups that came out from Apple and then would become like major companies that were like super interesting from your side.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, everything, it seems like everybody was trying. And that was, even Apple came up with the tagline. There's an app for that, right? It became a selling point for why you wanted to have the iPhone was because there was an app for all sorts of things in the real world that you could do. And this is at a time when Apple was competing against kind of a host of other smartphones out there, and it wasn't necessarily clear that Apple was going to be the winner. Remember, BlackBerry was very popular especially among business users. Windows was out there trying to do stuff, and eventually Google with Android, its operating system was out there as well. And so this was a very kind of huge, heated kind of early days, and Apple had this kind of clever way of kind of showing the world that there was all these different apps, right? And so, if you look at some of the interesting ones, I think that we think of now, Spotify had been a company that was created before the app economy. It was created for the European audience to stream music on computers, but with the arrival of the smartphone and the mobile computing world, that just seemed to be like peanut butter and jelly meant to be. And this would become a very interesting app, especially when it was allowed to come into the US. This became a very popular way for that app to be consumed. Think about music being streamed. It's not like an all-you-can-eat buffet. And we could talk more about that. Facebook, another company that had to adapt to the mobile computing world. This was a company that had started just a few years earlier for computers, but really, as people started kind of embracing the iPhone ideal of the world, they had to get on board with that as well. Another interesting company that I think is interesting in that time is a company called Epic Games. Epic Games was known for creating these big budget, almost movie-like video games that you would play on your consoles, whether it's Xbox or PlayStation or on your computer. And they started dabbling in mobile games as well, because mobile games were the economics were just so much different. And so that was, was there a future there? And so everybody's starting to play in the mobile space and trying to figure out, how are they going to meet their consumer in that new world? So it was a time of exploration, a time of rapid change.
Mhm. Yeah, and getting back to the point that you made about it was a very competitive market in the early days. It was like the Wild West, probably similar to how we're looking at AI today, where, you look at a company like OpenAI, you say, sure, but who knows whether they're going to be like the real winners or like the platform that, pretty much makes the whole ecosystem work in the next like 10, 20 years. There was the same scenario back then. Also because, as you say, it's very hard to forget how relevant, like, BlackBerry was, where they control, most of the market shares. And there is like a movie that just came out lately, which is quite interesting on the story. But behind it, I think probably the most interesting rivalry was as well between like Android and the Apple ecosystem, just because they were like two different philosophies, way of tackling the mobile ecosystem development. And also, in a weird way, one for maybe, and you tell me what you think about it, but maybe Android has been probably outside like YouTube, probably one of the best deals for Google. And then on the other side, it's also weird to think that Google operating as an open player in an ecosystem that wasn't locked in like the Apple ecosystem, more as a competitive choice rather than something that it was in the DNA of Google. But it would be interesting to understand on your side, what do you think of those early days, especially like on the perspective of Android versus the Apple ecosystem, how things developed. What do you see that was not trivial and that we give for granted that it was not supposed maybe to happen the way it did?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an interesting time, an interesting part of the history. Apple and Google, I think of are frenemies, right? And in that period of time, right before the arrival of the iPhone, you would almost think of Apple and Google as being friends. And in fact, the CEO, one of the CEO of Google was on the Apple board, and this was a close relationship. And then kind of the emergence of mobile occurred. And Google had made this acquisition in tens of millions of dollars for Android, which to your point would seem very prescient in an era when it would become a huge part of its business. And this was an operating system, an open operating system. The idea that if you think about how Apple works, they control the phone, the hardware, and they control the software. They develop their own internal software, the operating system, the OS, and Apple it's called iOS. That gives them a walled garden around this world. They can control a lot of different parts of that vertical integration. Google had a different idea with its operating system, its OS, Android. It was going to essentially put it out in the world for free and encourage phone makers to adopt it. And it was appealing to phone makers for a couple of reasons. The other way they could do it at that time was maybe they could license Windows or they could license other software, but it came in an expense, right? And it could become complicated, and start to look at this world of apps, and are you getting the apps? And the idea of making if you're a third party and you're going to go into somebody's app ecosystem, you want to have a lot of scale. And the promise of Android was if they could get that operating system onto a lot of different phone makers, they would start to have scale that would be appealing to those third-party developers as well. And so That was kind of the strategy of Android, and it very quickly worked out very well for Google. One of the big players, Samsung, they make their own phone. And it really became, in a lot of ways, the biggest competitor to the Apple iPhone was this Samsung phone that ran on the Android operating system. And so you kind of see Pepsi and Coke rise out of this incredibly complicated and very vibrant and competitive mobile phone ecosystem to really two dominant players globally very quickly in a way that I think surprised a lot of people how fast it consolidated that power. Um, and you started to see some kind of some things about that environment. Apple users tended to be more fluent. They would over time would start to take up a bigger share of young people, especially in the U.S. Android, perhaps seen as more global, uh, having larger figures outside of the U.S., that sort of thing. But nevertheless, it was a huge race.
Yeah, and one interesting point that you make in the book, and is not like trivial, is how Android managed to lock in the ecosystem of third-party hardware makers, even though it was not like Apple where you could enforce like those rules. There are some like there is a playbook that they use there, right? That made them also like successful because again, you switch on like Android phone, and you're gonna find um, default applications that are part of the Google ecosystem, but as you explain, the book is not something that they need, that they must do. It's more like part of also the strategy that Google use within like Android to make it successful, right?
Yeah. So Apple has this very powerful walled garden. It can control its user experience. And Google is looking at that and they want to compete with that. And it's very important to them what that out of box experience is like for the phone. Because when you pull out your iPhone out of that box, it just kind of works, and it's some of the magic of it. And the concern was, okay, Android, in order for it to be a real competitor and to have the that scale and be competitive and get all those third party programs on there, it had to be an Apple-like experience. And but they didn't control the hardware. And so what they did over time was figure out, kind of think about it as almost like a Russian doll inside a Russian doll inside a Russian doll of various contracts and incentives for phone makers to kind of adopt their rules. And essentially, one of the key things that they wanted was for the Google Play Store, their version of the App Store, to be on all these phones. That was going to be the gateway to the Android digital kingdom, if you will. One of the things about Android phones is the idea that they are open sourced and more like a computer, and that you can put third-party software onto these devices outside of the official Google App Store, right? But Google wanted to make basically their gateway, the easiest way to do that. And so they kind of pushed contracts that would ensure that the Play Store was there. They would often tie it with other popular Google apps such as Mail or Maps, and this all kind of came bundled together. And the phone maker over time with the various contracts would have various incentives to do that. So maybe it would unlock various apps that they would get. There would be a revenue share that they would start to share in the revenue that's generated from the ecosystem at Google. And this was very kind of powerful kind of marriage that they created with the likes of Samsung and other hardware makers out there.
It's quite impressive to me that that worked so well and for so long. And closing on this, do you think like moving like in a future scenario, this sort of third-party ecosystem will work, or like Google needs to figure out also a way to scale up its own hardware strategy? What do you think there?
Well, Google has also done its own phone, Pixel, and the strategy in that is kind of twofold. They wanted to create essentially like the best of the best out there in their minds to demonstrate all the capabilities that were available in Android to kind of encourage other hardware makers to take advantage and do the same thing, right? That one of the challenges that they have is that there's a whole variety of phone makers out there, and there perhaps sometimes is a perception that some of the lower end phones are Android and you're not getting the same kind of Apple-like experience. It's kind of for the cheap, right? And they want to play at the high end. And Samsung creates a very high end, beautiful phone, and the Pixel is kind of in that realm as well. And kind of you read in the book there, a lot of time is being spent by Google executives like trying to crack this competition with Apple and how can they be more competitive. In part, their research would suggest that once you get into the Apple ecosystem, it's very hard to get somebody out into the Android. It's very hard to switch. Now, Apple would argue that it's you can do it, it's easy, but the reality is for a lot of users is once you choose Coke or Pepsi, you're not just going to go with the other one, right? You're kind of locked in for life, perhaps, right? And that's a very important and valuable relationship that these companies get. And so, um, at every step you see Google trying to figure out how they can be, if not as good as Apple, even better. And this is definitely on their mind. And one of the challenges that Google executives were facing is that a lot of the hottest, most popular apps weren't going to Google Play, right? They were going to Apple either first or Apple only. And one of the big money makers in the app economy would turn out to be video games. People see this as a video game device, especially the iPhone with all of its computing processing and the screen. And you look at the high end the phones out there, and they're in a lot of ways like video game machines for people. And the people that are playing on those machines, it's a small number of people, but they spent a lot of money potentially in those games. And because of the Apple App Store revenue share, Apple was getting a lot of money, and Google, it adopted very similar rules as Apple and was getting a lot of money, right? So there was a lot of incentive for Google to figure out a way to get those same video games and same hot apps into their store as well. And so you see this tension that's building there.
Yeah, and we'll get back on the discussion Apple and Google because it's been probably one of the most important relationship of the last like 20 years from multiple perspectives. But maybe not many people know, and you highlighted in the book as well, the fact that at a certain point Apple has been also or at least tried to dominate like the books space, trying to eat the lunch of a company like Amazon, who was like very like the one where define like the category. And yet today, you at least for my side, I'm someone who reads a lot, but we don't think of Apple as any relevant there. But there has been a period of its history where this was a real attempt, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. This goes back to the days just after the iPhone. So the iPhone is successful. I'm talking about 2009, 2010, and the iPad is coming, right? And the iPad had always been, this had been one of the big dreams. The device that would, be bigger than the iPhone. I think everybody knows an iPad looks like, right? And this, and this was going to be another way to consume media out there, right? And Steve Jobs had long felt that the iPhone was not the right size to consume books. It's too small in his mind. And so he'd been against the idea of getting into the book business. And this is at a time, remember, this is at a period of time of great kind of technological change for a lot of industries. The iPhone, the iPod, which was the music player that Apple had come out with prior to the iPhone, had got them into the music business. It had been very profitable for them in a way that I think a lot of people were really surprised. I think the general kind of consensus early on was that iTunes music for Apple was really just a way to sell hardware But over time, it became a huge revenue generator on its own and really made Apple kind of in the music business and really was kind of the fuel for why they went on with the iPhone because there was concern they were going to lose their music business as people merged digital music players with smartphones, and it just all seemed like be heading in the same place. So that's kind of the background of how the Apple people were thinking about these devices for consuming media, right? And so one of the Apple executives sees the new iPad and is just, well, we got to get books on here. This is just a natural way to consume that media. Amazon has got their e-reader out there, the Kindle, and the iPad is just so much cooler, they think. You got a color screen. There's just so much more they could do. And Steve Jobs agrees, um, but they got to go fast. They're months away from launching this thing, the iPad. They want to launch it at one of their classic Apple events and in that January. And so there's a rush to figure out, can they get these books, can they get deals with the book publishers to be on the iPad? And they go to the publishers in New York. There's the big kind of small group of them who control so much of the world's books. And they're arriving at a perfect time because the book publishers are very unhappy with the power that Amazon has over their kingdom. They were accustomed to doing things a certain way for many generations, and here Amazon is a huge disruption to that. And the economics of the book business are threatened. In particular, the digital books. They have seen what happened to digital music and how the economics for the music industry collapsed. They are worried the same thing is going to happen to them. And on top of that, Amazon is pushing very aggressively um, into getting these titles, and they feel like they're getting undercut in a way that they're just very worried about. And so Apple shows up, and there's this feeling that Apple could be negotiating leverage to kind of push back. It's nice to have something. They don't want only one person ruling the roost, right? And so it's kind of a perfect kind of storm. Apple is very excited to get deals done as quickly as possible, but it doesn't want to it doesn't want a worse deal than what Amazon has. And you see in kind of the emails that go back and forth and the meeting notes between all these people. Apple is going to meeting individually with the publishers, and the publishers are all talking to each other about what's going on. And there's a push to kind of do this. And essentially, what happens is an argument gets kind of emerges that um, Apple doesn't want a worse deal than Amazon. Um, and you kind of, if they're going to sell it at a certain price, then Amazon has to sell it at that certain price. And so, kind of the suggestion is, well, you could make the pie bigger, and then we could share it. And so, several of the publishers sign up to be with Apple. They announce it, and it's very good. And you start to see prices of the new books going on to the digital marketplace increase because of this. And regulators take note, and they say, "Wait a second, this doesn't this doesn't seem right." And the Justice Department goes after Apple and some of these book publishers over this kind of dealing, and it becomes a very contentious fight. Ultimately, Apple is found by a judge to have acted improperly and kind of this price fixing scheme. And Apple, of course, denied wrongdoing and fought it very vigorously. But it was really kind of the first example, one of the first really good examples of the power that was being consolidated in these digital marketplaces and kind of a prelude of things to come. That Apple would create a marketplace, a digital marketplace, and then do all it could do to make sure that it was getting its what it thought was its fair share. And the concern that some outsiders had was that the consumer was ending up paying that bill, or that players within that market really didn't have a lot of control or pushback to that. And so we would see that kind of dynamic play out for years to come.
hmm And this probably connects to another very important like part of the ecosystem. And in the book, like there are several parts where you actually explain how when asked about the the competition in the market. I think there is probably an interview that you mentioned about Tim Cook that asked who is your competition. He says it's Google. It's
Mhm.
not under the radar of Apple. There was not necessarily like another major company, at least a company that would become another big tech player, who is like Facebook, that then became Meta. And that's because Apple never really made the decision to enter directly the social media business, but more like empowered it from a business ecosystem standpoint. But that is like a very interesting, perspective that you have there in the way the relationship between Apple and Facebook has changed over the years, and also different philosophies. But also, my question is more not just like about the philosophical view, but also like sort of the way Apple tried to as well to control the ecosystem, on the Facebook side. What is your
Yeah.
perspective?
It's interesting. You mentioned this Tim Cook, very famous Tim Cook interview. I think it was in 2014. This idea that Google was its competition, that it was its rival. And one of the things that you start hearing Tim Cook frame Google, the way they frame Google is that they're making money off of your data and that you should follow the money. And Apple started in its public statements and its marketing really kind of emphasizing the privacy that it was giving its users on the iPhone. And I think it's something that they believe very, very strongly in, without a doubt. And kind of what kind of the implied issue here is that Google makes a lot of its money, still to this day, from selling ads, search ads, right? You go into Google, you search something, and then it's populated by the top of it, it's populated by ads, right? And you click on that and they get some money, right? And Apple wasn't in the search business technically, but um, Google early on realized the importance of needing to be on Apple devices with its search menu, search bar, and started cutting deals with Apple to ensure that it was the default search bar in Safari and then other ways on the iPhone. And it started off, in the millions of dollars, but eventually it would grow to be tens of billions of dollars to Apple. And for many years, this was not really well known. These were secret. The terms of these deals were secret. There was an understanding that there was a relationship, but it wasn't very clear to the public. So in a lot of ways, Apple might not have been in the search business, might not have been in the advertising business like Google, but it was profiting from Google's business. And that was very important. It was a relationship that benefited Apple, getting a huge, essentially free money, like free, essentially uh, huge profitability, like all the dollars coming in. This is just kind of right to the profit. And for Google, a huge percentage of their search traffic was coming from these Apple users, right? So very important. On one hand, huge competitors. On the other hand, huge partners, frenemies, right? And so you see this kind of that back in the background relationship. In the meantime, as Facebook, now known as Meta, but we'll call them Facebook for this conversation, um, starts to emerge as a kind of big tech, and its place in the world starts to be questioned for its kind of stances on privacy, and the bigger privacy question starts to be take on a new kind of life of its own. Think about after the U.S. presidential elections in 2016, Trump and the concerns of kind of foreign influence in that election and how social media might have been used. Think about Brexit. Think about just kind of the general concerns of user privacy. And Facebook is kind of in the center of all of that. And Tim Cook starts coming out criticizing Facebook in a way that really was angering Mark Zuckerberg. In part, probably because in the background, Facebook had felt pressure from Apple to change its business model. They wanted Facebook to kind of adopt, Facebook is an advertising company as well. essentially making its money from its users' data in clever ways. And but Apple doesn't get a cut of that. It's so at Facebook, the Facebook app, Instagram app, WhatsApp, hugely important in that Apple ecosystem. That's where they access a lot of their users. But Apple wasn't really getting any profit from any of that, or in the same way that it was from other apps. And there had definitely been pressure over time to for Facebook, why couldn't they adopt a subscription model instead of advertising, right? And then Apple would collect money from that. And that wasn't flying. And so you see that tension going on in the background as well. And Mark Zuckerberg early on realized the challenge that Facebook had being so tied to the Apple kingdom. He might have a billion users, but at that time, but a lot of them were getting to his kingdom through the Apple kingdom, right? And so they were beholden to Apple's rules and Apple's way of doing business. And so at various points, Zuckerberg has tried to figure out his own hardware play, but making a phone that could compete in that kind of Pepsi and Coke world was very hard and really didn't see any success there. We could probably talk a little bit longer
Yeah.
about the other hardware in the future, but at this point in time that we're talking about, they're struggling, and it was prescient. Um, Apple would eventually come out with tougher privacy rules for software operating on its devices, and particularly the iPhone, essentially creating a new rule that, not essentially, but creating a new rule where third-party apps had to receive their users' permission to track them on the internet. And this was a key part of how Facebook was making its ad business and blah, blah, blah. Well, you can imagine users aren't like, hey, that'd be great. I'd love to give you that authority, right? So this became a huge uh, headwind to Facebook's business. At one point, at one point they were talking about, a huge blow, right? And so it just showed how powerful Apple to change rules were could affect these ecosystems that had built up over the years, right? Massive, some of the biggest businesses in the world were being materially affected by Apple's change in policies.
Yeah, and I've been working in the digital marketing industry for quite some time now, and I can tell you that talking to like different clients, there are like businesses who never recovered from the update in 2019, the iOS update
Yeah,
on the Apple side. And yet, there was also like an update that pushed Meta to rebuild its own like attribution ecosystem in order to actually survive, at least like be more solid. But as you say, and maybe we can touch upon it a little bit further later. But the next challenge is going to be on the AI interfaces, which is
hmm
call them AI interfaces just because again, AR right now it's becoming like viable finally because of AI that enables those interfaces to become possible in the first place, because even the band that you're using with the Meta glasses is actually like a neural band that is actually tracking movements and stuff too. So there is a lot
yeah,
of in it and stuff. So we can touch upon it. But before we get there, just quick on one of the most interesting as well relationship, and something that I figure in your book that I didn't know. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, has meeting every year with Tim Cook on the state of the partnership, right? Uh,
yeah, right.
how is the relationship right now? It evolved a little bit. And then I guess from there we can move directly on the fun stuff, which is like AI interfaces, where we're going, what do you think? But
Yeah. Well, so we start to see, we kind of laid out the environment here. So clearly, Apple has a lot of power over its digital empire that it's created, right? Uh, Billions, if not trillions of dollars coming through it all. And you start to see rivals question if that's legal in the US and in Europe and the UK and other places. And they go about it in different ways, whether through courts or trying to get laws changed. And one of the pressure points is the relationship between Google and Apple and this special relationship. And the Justice Department in the US goes after Google for these kinds of deals that it has with Apple and others that kind of ensure that it gets a special place in the search world. And the US government wins on that. And one of the requested remedies was that Google wouldn't be able to pay Apple for this special relationship. And this had grown to something like $20 billion a year that Apple was getting. So, a percentage, not an insignificant percentage of their operating profit is just coming from this one deal, right? And and this was a big threat. Now, the federal judge ultimately would say that that Google can continue these deals with Apple. They limited Google's power in other ways, but the deal survives for now. And that was a huge win for these two companies. And part of the judge's ruling and kind of remedies was concern that Google's place in the world was its power was diminishing. Yes, it was a monopoly in search, but the rise of AI is changing things rapidly. Artificial intelligence, in particular, how people search out information through these chatbots like OpenAI's ChatGPT, and that creates new competition and the ability for somebody new to rise up, right? And so it gets to one of the cyclical nature things that we see in technology, that the rise of companies from kind of the adoption or the deployment of a new technology, they very quickly become dominant players with their rules and their markets that they're able to extract a lot of power from. But then something new comes along, and maybe they get distracted as they fight to control or protect their kingdom, and something new comes out at the same time. And history is littered with these kinds of fights. Think of IBM a couple of generations ago. It's fighting the US government, and Microsoft comes kind of rises through the personal computer. And then, as Microsoft is fighting regulators in the US and in Europe over the power it had, the mobile computing world with Apple kind of emerges, right? And Apple, under threat for its power in the mobile world, now faces kind of another kind of pivotal moment and potentially the kind of the change of things. And so, is it going to be artificial intelligence, which ushers in a new way of kind of accessing that digital world? That's the big question.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
and
so I think to go back to your question, how's the relationship between Apple and Google? It's still strong, but how much longer are they going to be able to get that money? Well, probably for a while here, they're going to continue, but the question is what's next?
Yeah, and you touch so many critical points here. And one thing that I've been seeing for a few years, if you want to take on the Google business model, the first step that you got to do in terms of like competition is actually to take over the deal from Apple, even if it's like a very expensive one, which is like probably a 20 billion per year deal, right? So
Yeah, I mean, even Microsoft tried to get in there and wasn't able to do it. Microsoft, according to the records and testimonies, was very aggressive in trying to woo Apple to letting Microsoft's Bing be the default. And in fact, Microsoft CEO even testified in that case that we were talking about. And they worried that those kind of relationships Google would have an advantage in going into AI because they would have all that data from search and stuff. And it's interesting because Microsoft clearly is no slouch when it comes to AI. They have been aggressive with their partnership with OpenAI and now have benefited greatly from that. And so, it's all these companies are fighting over their place in the ecosystem.
yeah, and a key difference that you touched upon that made me think is uh, there is slightly different right now is as you say, antitrust play the key role over the years in distracting the dominant
Hmm.
player, the incumbent that actually enabled a new market to develop. You said it with
Yeah.
IBM, then Microsoft, and now. But the interesting thing is right now the antitrust is like it said something else. Like AI is a market disruption so strong that there is not even a need for us to intervene because this is gonna disrupt anyhow the search business. Um, might be temporary. I believe they know it maybe at Google because you see how much they're pushing even in the browser. They enable, like for instance, AI mode, which is Google agent in the browser, similar to how
Hmm.
Perplexity does, which tells us also that they're trying to leverage as much as possible in the short term and push their own AI, as
Sure.
much as possible because they don't know how much is going to last. These truths, like this place of the antitrust, thinking that still AI is so competitive that even Google cannot compete in its own core business, which is super interesting to me. And going back to the AI interfaces, I think another point I would like to know your perspective there. It seems that for how much and trying they had like such relationships evolving over the years. In reality, everyone is converging to be like an enemy in the short term because everyone is going to try to dominate a new interface like AR. Everyone
Sure.
is trying to be there.
Yeah, I mean it's a moment in time where I'm based in San Francisco, Silicon Valley is down the street, and San Francisco is kind of the key, a hot spot for AI development. But there's a conventional wisdom that has kind of grown up in Silicon Valley right now that the platforms are open to disruption, that this is a technology that will help shuffle the deck, if you will, that like the emergence of mobile, like the emergence of these other technologies, new players can take new dominance, right? That Apple's place as the gatekeeper to the digital world is not assured in this next revolution. And so you see a lot of companies trying to position themselves to be that new Apple, if you will. Now, Tim Cook would argue, the CEO of Apple, that the importance of the screen will continue in AI, that there's still utility here, desire to look at things. Others are saying they think that there'll be a potential, whether it's glasses, which Mark Zuckerberg is making the gamble that this is the perfect new device. The devices he has shown are, I think you should think of them as kind of the steps towards what his bigger vision is. And he's talked about a vision of super intelligence for consumers that they access through their glasses, and there's a lens that allows them to see things that they want to see in real time that helps augment their world. But dealing with that super intelligence AI um, through audio, through speaking, is a big gamble. And he's not alone in making this kind of bet. OpenAI, we don't know what their device exactly is. We've kind of gotten hints, but the idea is that it kind of would be always on and you would talk to it, and that's how you would access the digital world. And you kind of interact with these kind of chatbots in a way that's potentially very powerful, right? And so that's kind of some of the vision out there that people think that we're heading towards, right? And Apple's abilities right now in AI chat are not where others are at. Now, the gamble, some investors are betting that it doesn't matter, that that these companies such as Microsoft and OpenAI and others like Grok, Apple, Elon Musk's chatbot, these things are hugely expensive. They're requiring just mountains of cash to essentially be burned to buy up the computing power to train them and whatnot, and that there will be a leveling out, and that maybe Apple can then come in with its version or an adoption of somebody else's version down the road, and it'll kind of skipped all of that money burning part. We don't know, right? That's the gamble, right? Who's going to control the gateway to that new generation of technology? That is kind of the fight that's being played out right now.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's nice to close there. Thank you for your perspective, Tim. It was super interesting. Maybe we'll connect in the future to see who's going to win the AI AR race as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your interest. It's always good to talk to you.
Thank you, Tim.